The Rook family was, by all outward appearances, an ordinary family seeking a fresh start. Jonathan Rook, a practical yet weary man in his early 40s, had recently lost his job at the local mill, a blow that forced the family to sell their cramped apartment in the city. His wife, Elizabeth, a gentlewoman with an indomitable spirit, believed that change was not always a curse, but often a harbinger of new beginnings. Their 2 children, Sarah, a sensitive, introspective 17-year-old, and little Michael, a curious boy of 9 with an imagination that knew no bounds, shared in the cautious optimism that accompanied the promise of a new life in the countryside. When the opportunity arose to purchase a sprawling estate at a fraction of its market value, Jonathan's skepticism gave way to reluctant hope. The advertisement had been sparse on details, a musty, sepia-toned photograph of the grand facade accompanied by a single sentence: "A timeless abode awaits its next chapter." Jonathan's initial misgivings, the nagging thought that something was amiss, were drowned out by the practicalities of their financial straits. How could one say no to such a bargain when the future held no guarantees? The estate was known as Blackthorn House, and its remote location, deep in the wooded hills, promised the privacy and tranquility the family so desperately craved. The seller, an enigmatic elderly man with an unplaceable accent and a gaze that seemed to pierce one's soul, insisted on a swift, no-questions-asked sale. The Rooks, desperate to leave behind the city's claustrophobic chaos, agreed without a second thought. As the ink dried on the archaic deeds, a chill crept over the assembled group. It was as though the very walls of Blackthorn House exhaled a cold breath, a premonition that the house was aware of its new inhabitants. Yet optimism prevailed. The family packed their meager belongings, not knowing that the legacy of darkness that haunted the estate would soon envelop them. The journey to Blackthorn House was long and winding, the narrow country roads meandering through ancient forests where gnarled branches clawed at the sky. With every mile that separated them from the city, the air grew heavier, laden with the scent of decay and damp earth. Michael's eyes, wide with wonder and trepidation, darted to the passing trees, convinced that unseen eyes followed their car. As the family crested a ridge, the mansion emerged from the mist like a specter. Its silhouette was imposing, a labyrinth of turrets and crumbling stone, draped in ivy and cloaked in perpetual twilight. The house seemed to leer at them, its broken windows resembling hollow eyes that watched in silent malice. Elizabeth hesitated, her heart fluttering in her chest, but Jonathan's determination pushed them forward. "This is our new beginning," he assured, though even his voice wavered as he approached the looming structure. The front door, a massive oak barrier adorned with intricate carvings of twisting vines and arcane symbols, creaked open with a mournful groan as if greeting old friends. Inside, the foyer was shrouded in shadow. Dust motes swirled in the faint light that filtered through the grime-coated glass. The air was stale, carrying the scent of long-forgotten memories and something else, something acrid and metallic that hinted at past horrors. In the weeks that followed, the Rooks busied themselves with the practicalities of renovation. They cleared away debris, patched up rotting floors, and attempted to bring a semblance of warmth to the oppressive atmosphere. Yet from the very first night, the house made its presence known. Unexplained creaks and whispering winds and empty halls kept them awake. Doors would open on their own, and shadows seemed to slither along the walls, always at the edge of their vision. At first, these disturbances were dismissed as the quirks of an old house settling into its new inhabitants. But as the days turned into weeks, the phenomena grew more unsettling. Sarah, whose sensitivity to the unseen was well known, began to record frantic journal entries describing disembodied voices calling her name in the dead of night. Michael, in his innocent yet vivid imagination, spoke of a lady in white who roamed the halls, her eyes brimming with sorrow and malice. Despite these alarming occurrences, the family clung to hope. They believed that with time, the house's temperament would mellow, that the strange happenings were but echoes of a troubled past. Yet beneath the veneer of normalcy, Blackthorn House harbored a malignant secret that would soon unravel the very fabric of the Rook family's existence. It was on a stormy autumn evening that the true nature of the house began to reveal itself. Rain hammered against the windows, and the wind howled as if mourning lost souls. Jonathan, ever the skeptic, attempted to reassure his family by lighting candles and gathering them in the parlor, a room adorned with faded portraits of long-dead ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow every move. As the clock struck midnight, a sudden silence fell over the house, as if the storm itself had been swallowed by an unseen void. Then came a faint tapping, barely audible above the pounding rain. Elizabeth, clutching Sarah's hand, crept toward the source of the sound, a narrow corridor, lined with closed doors. The air in the hallway was unnaturally cold, and each step echoed in a rhythm that quickened their heartbeats. At the far end of the corridor, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from behind a heavy wooden door, its surface carved with symbols that Elizabeth now recognized from her late grandmother's old grimoire, a book filled with dark folklore and warnings of cursed places. With trembling hands, Jonathan reached out and slowly pushed the door open. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, save for a single beam of moonlight that illuminated a dusty antique mirror. For a fleeting moment, Elizabeth thought she saw a figure standing behind her reflection, a gaunt, spectral visage with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. But when she spun around, there was no one there. A low, guttural whisper filled the silence, echoing off the walls. "Lee," it seemed to say. A single word repeated over and over in a voice that resonated with ancient malice. The family froze, terror gripping their hearts. Michael whimpered, and Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears. Jonathan, trying to muster courage, pulled his wife and children back into the safety of the parlor. That night, sleep was elusive. Each member of the family was tormented by nightmares, a cacophony of screams, ghastly apparitions, and the relentless sound of tapping that haunted their every attempt at rest. In the cold light of dawn, they awoke drenched in sweat, the taste of fear bitter on their tongues. Yet despite the terror of that first night, they rationalized it as the product of an overactive imagination, fueled by the isolation of their new home. But Blackthorn House had already marked them. The malignant force within its walls had stirred, and the seeds of dread had been sown. In the days that followed, subtle changes would escalate into full-blown horrors, sealing the family's fate in a nightmare from which there could be no escape. In the weeks after that fateful night, the subtle became grotesque. What had once been isolated incidents now converged into a series of unrelenting horrors that chipped away at the family's sanity. Doors slammed without cause, objects moved inexplicably, and the once comforting tick of the antique clock in the foyer now mocked them with its irregular, distorted beats. Sarah, whose nights were plagued by visions, began to confide in an old diary she discovered tucked away in a secret compartment behind a loose brick in the library. The diary belonged to a young woman named Lillian Blackthorn, a former resident whose final entries spoke of a demonic presence that took root in the house. Lillian's words were frantic, her handwriting jagged with panic. It whispers in the dark. I see shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. The walls bleed at night, and I fear that the house is alive. It hungers for our souls. I pray that whoever reads these words is spared the fate that awaits me. The diary's contents sent a shiver down Sarah's spine, but she kept it hidden, afraid of alarming her parents. Meanwhile, Jonathan's attempts to restore normalcy grew increasingly desperate. He sought out local historians and even a reclusive medium known only as Madame Violette, whose reputation for dealing with the supernatural was as infamous as it was respected. Madame Violette arrived one drizzly afternoon, her eyes alight with both sorrow and determination. As she stepped into the foyer, she paused, her gaze lingering on the portraits. These souls, they are trapped, she murmured. The curse is old and deep. This house is not merely haunted, it is possessed by an ancient malice. Her words, meant to warn rather than to frighten, only deepened the sense of impending doom. She explained that the curse was woven into the very fabric of the building, a result of the blood sacrifices and dark rituals performed on its ground centuries ago. The house had become a living entity, a dark mirror reflecting the evil that had once been unleashed upon it. And now it was hungry. In the following days, the house's malevolence escalated. Late at night, Elizabeth awoke to the sound of soft weeping coming from the walls themselves. The sound was sorrowful, yet laced with a cruel amusement, as if the house took pleasure in her torment. One morning, Michael discovered deep crimson handprints smeared across his bedroom door, as if someone or something had tried desperately to claw its way in or out. Jonathan, who prided himself on rationality, began to doubt even his own eyes when he found that the furniture in the dining room had been rearranged into grotesque formations resembling ancient symbols. The family's once hopeful sanctuary had transformed into a prison of terror, each new day heralding fresh horrors that defied explanation. Their attempts to escape the oppressive atmosphere were thwarted by the very geography of the estate. Every exit seemed to lead them back to the labyrinthine heart of the house, as if Blackthorn House itself was a living maze determined to ensnare its prey. As the days bled into nights, the strain of the supernatural torment began to fracture the bonds of the Rook family. Paranoia seeped into every conversation, and mistrust replaced the love that had once held them together. Elizabeth, once a beacon of calm, now found herself weeping uncontrollably at the slightest provocation, her eyes haunted by visions of spectral figures stalking her through endless corridors. Jonathan's once steady hand trembled as he attempted to wield the tools of repair, his mind plagued by the unyielding thought that unseen forces were toying with him. One fateful evening, as twilight succumbed to the oppressive dark, an event occurred that would irrevocably shatter the fragile remnants of their sanity. Sarah had been holed up in her room, feverish and restless from nights spent in terror, when a loud crash echoed through the halls. Rushing out, she found the living room in disarray. Shattered glass, overturned furniture, and a pool of dark, congealed blood that stained the Persian rug. In the center of the carnage lay the body of the family's old tabby cat, its eyes wide in eternal horror, its body mutilated beyond recognition. The sight was too much for Sarah to bear. In that moment, the whispers of the house, the voices that had been mere murmurs before, became a cacophony of hissing laughter and mocking jeers. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and the very air was saturated with the coppery stench of blood. Sarah's screams echoed through the corridors, drawing her family into a maelstrom of panic. Jonathan rushed to his daughter's side, but as he did, he became aware of a presence looming behind him. In the mirror above the fireplace, a figure stood, a gaunt, emaciated shape draped in tattered clothing, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. Before Jonathan could react, the figure lunged, its claws slashing through the air. In the ensuing struggle, Jonathan felt a searing pain as if his very soul were being wrenched from his body. He collapsed, blood pouring from a deep gash in his side. Elizabeth, hearing her husband's anguished cry, stumbled into the room. In her shock and grief, she did not see the spectral form creeping along the wall until it was too late. The apparition circled her like a predator, whispering venomous words that eroded her sanity with every syllable. Her mind, already frayed by terror, snapped under the relentless assault. With a final, shuddering scream, Elizabeth fell to the floor, her life extinguished by an invisible hand that drew her into the darkness. Michael, who had been hiding under the stairs, emerged to witness the carnage with wide, terrified eyes. The horror of losing his parents in such a brutal and inexplicable fashion was too overwhelming for his young mind. In a state of shock, he ran blindly through the halls, seeking refuge in the only place that had once been a sanctuary, his bedroom. But the house, as if mocking his flight, sealed off every exit. Doors slammed shut, corridors twisted into unfamiliar paths, and the gentle hum of childhood comfort was replaced by a relentless, otherworldly chant that whispered his name. In the midst of this maelstrom of madness, Sarah's grief transformed into a desperate, vengeful fury. With the diary of Lillian Blackthorn clutched in her trembling hand, she resolved to unearth the secrets of the cursed estate, determined to fight back against the malevolent force that had stolen her family. But as she delved deeper into the arcane rituals and forbidden lore, she realized that some secrets were best left buried. The cursed energies that had long simmered beneath the surface of Blackthorn House now surged forth with violent abandon. Apparitions materialized in every corner, and the boundaries between the physical and the spectral dissolved into a chaotic dance of agony and despair. The house's halls, once silent witnesses to forgotten tragedies, now roared with the screams of the damned. It was as though the building itself had become a conduit for every soul that had ever suffered within its walls. A living mausoleum of grief and retribution. In the shadow of encroaching madness, Sarah's research led her to an ancient ritual that promised to sever the dark bond between the house and its cursed legacy. The ritual, detailed in cryptic passages of Lillian's diary, required a sacrifice of both blood and spirit. A dangerous gambit that could either free the tortured souls trapped within or plunge the living further into oblivion. Desperation had driven Sarah to the brink, and with trembling resolve, she prepared to enact the ritual in the estate's crumbling chapel, a forgotten room at the far end of the east wing. The chapel was a relic of a time when the estate had been a place of worship, its once hallowed walls now defaced by decay and despair. Faded murals of saints and angels stared down mournfully, their eyes filled with sorrow at the desecration of the sacred space. At the center of the chapel stood an altar, its surface scarred by deep gouges and dried, crusted blood. Sarah arranged the items as prescribed by the ritual: a vial of her own blood, a lock of Elizabeth's hair salvaged from her final moments, and the diary of Lillian Blackthorn, now more than a record of terror. It was a beacon for the house's dark energies. As midnight approached, the storm outside reached a fever pitch, lightning illuminating the chapel in staccato bursts. Sarah, reciting the incantations written in Lillian's hand, felt an overwhelming presence converge upon her. The air thickened, and the walls seemed to close in as if eager to witness the culmination of centuries-old malice. Then, as she cut her palm and let her blood drip onto the altar, the very fabric of reality trembled. A vortex of shadow and flame erupted from the altar, and for a moment, Sarah was suspended in a realm of agony and despair. She saw visions of the past, the forbidden rituals and the anguished cries of the sacrificed, the relentless hunger of the darkness that had been sown long ago. A towering, spectral figure emerged from the vortex, a manifestation of the curse itself. Its form was ever-shifting, a grotesque amalgamation of every tortured soul that had ever been claimed by the house. It spoke in a chorus of voices, each tone dripping with malice. "You dare defy the will of the house. You shall feed our hunger, and you shall join us in eternal torment." Sarah's resolve wavered as the figure extended a clawed hand toward her. In that moment, the boundaries of her mortal strength broke, and she felt the pull of an abyss that promised oblivion. The blood on the altar began to sizzle and bubble, forming sinister patterns that writhed like living serpents. The spectral figure advanced, and as it reached for her, the very foundations of Blackthorn House shuddered in response. Elsewhere in the mansion, the remaining vestiges of sanity among the Rook family's scattered souls, Jonathan's fading consciousness, Elizabeth's lingering spirit, and Michael's terrified mind, were caught in the inexorable pull of the house's dark destiny. Michael, lost in a labyrinth of corridors that defied reason, could hear the echo of his sister's voice, a faint plea for salvation that was swallowed by the cacophony of screams. Jonathan's mind drifted between life and death, tormented by memories of happier times, now tainted with the stench of blood and despair. And Elizabeth's spirit, bound by a love that refused to be extinguished, hovered on the threshold of a realm beyond mortal comprehension, yearning for a reunion that was forever denied. As the ritual reached its climax, the chapel became a crucible of agony. The altar, bathed in unholy light, began to split open as if swallowing the very essence of the house's malevolence. The spectral figure let out a sound, a discordant wail that reverberated through every stone and shadow. And in that moment, Sarah felt a searing pain in her chest, as though the curse had taken physical form to claim her life. Collapsing before the altar, she watched in horror as the dark vortex consumed her. Her last thoughts a frantic prayer for forgiveness that would never be answered. The aftermath of the ritual was a maelstrom of chaos and despair. Blackthorn House, once a silent predator lurking in the shadows, now erupted in a final, cataclysmic display of its unyielding wrath. The very walls bled from innumerable fissures, and the floors quaked as though the building itself were convulsing in agony. The remaining remnants of the Rook family, already shattered by grief and terror, were swept into a maelstrom of violence that defied human understanding. And Michael, the lone survivor of the living, found himself cornered in the narrow passageway where the spectral energies converged into a vortex of despair. The corridors twisted into impossible geometries, and the voices of the dead clamored in his ears, each syllable a dagger of sorrow. Desperate to escape, he ran blindly, his small frame battered by invisible forces that pulled him toward a destiny too horrible to imagine. In one final heart-stopping moment, Michael was confronted by the embodiment of the curse, a monstrous amalgamation of every lost soul, every drop of blood spilled on these cursed grounds. Its eyes burned with the fury of countless tormented spirits, and its form was a writhing mass of shadow and agony. With a scream that echoed the lamentations of the damned, Michael was engulfed by the darkness. His cries faded into silence as the house claimed yet another life, sealing the fate of the Rook family in a tableau of eternal horror. Outside, the storm raged on, oblivious to the tragedies that had unfolded within the cursed walls of Blackthorn House. The mansion stood silent once more, its malevolent energy receding into the deep recesses of its ancient stones. For a time, it seemed as though the house would return to a semblance of slumber, its hunger temporarily sated. But the legacy of its dark past was far from extinguished. In the quiet that followed the storm, Blackthorn House appeared to be nothing more than a crumbling relic, a monument to decay and the passage of time. Yet for those who dared to look closely, there were signs that the darkness still lingered. Faded footprints in the dust, inexplicable smudges of blood on the banister, and the faint echo of a child's laughter in the dead of night served as grim reminders that the curse was eternal. Local legend passed down from one generation to the next would eventually speak of the Rook family, a family whose hopeful journey ended in a tragedy so profound that it stained the very soul of the estate. Some claim that on certain nights, if one listened closely by the broken windows of Blackthorn House, they could hear the whispers of a little boy calling out for his sister, the anguished wails of a mother pleading for mercy, and the anguished groans of a father trapped between life and death. And in the silence, the house seemed to pulse with a dark, ancient heartbeat, waiting patiently for its next victims. For now, the cycle of horror had been laid to rest, only to stir again when fate would lead another unsuspecting family to cross its threshold. The curse, born of blood and ritual, was an eternal force, thriving in the decay of time and the desperation of the living. Blackthorn House, with all its cruelty and malice, remained a silent sentinel over the valley, a place where hope went to die and nightmares were given free rein. And so ends the chronicle of the Rook family, whose dreams of a new beginning were devoured by the insatiable hunger of a cursed estate. The House of Eternal Dread stands as a grim monument to the power of ancient evil, a reminder that some doors once opened can never be closed.